Hello and welcome. My name is Richard Jackson and I'm the Deputy Director of Violent Risk Forecasting at IHS. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this online intelligence briefing focusing on the context, risk and implications of the crisis in Korea. The IHS Janes online seminar series will run approximately 50 events in 2013 and is available to all customers of Janes Intelligence Centre or module products, including the DS Forecast products. For this webinar, we're also welcoming IHS Exclusive Analysis and IHS Maritime customers. Before we get into the meat of the session, I've got a few technical housekeeping points to help you get the most from what we're about to go through. We encourage you all to ask questions during the presentation. If you'd like to do this, please use the Q&A or the chat boxes that you can see on the right-hand side of your computer screen. And most importantly, please address your questions to all panelists. Any questions we get will be put to the presenters at the end of the session, and any questions we don't get around to answering will be addressed by our analysts afterwards. When you logged into this seminar, you're automatically connected to the audio using your computer speakers. But if you prefer to listen via the telephone, please click the Request a Telephone icon above the chat window and follow instructions which pop up. Please turn down the volume on your computer speakers if you listen via the phone to eliminate any echo. For this afternoon's session, I'm joined here in the London office by Neil Ashdown, Asia Analyst at IHS Country Risk Analysis and Forecasting, James Hardy, who's the Asia Pacific Editor at IHS Janes Defence Weekly, Crispin Atkinson, a Business Analyst at IHS Maritime, and Gary Lee, a Senior Analyst at IHS Maritime. We're also really fortunate to be joined by Nick Hansen from the Centre for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University, Jim Dorschner, IHS Janes Expert Contributor on South Korea, and Alison Puccioni, IHS Janes Senior Imagery Analyst. Between us, we're going to look at the risks and implications of the situation on the Korean Peninsula. Since the most recent nuclear test carried out by North Korea in February and the imposition of further UN sanctions, there have been increasingly provocative statements. In one of the North's latest, it declared that it pre-authorized a nuclear strike on the US. On Monday, it closed the Kaesong industrial complex, and on Tuesday, it advised foreigners in South Korea to leave the country. Some of the more recent North Korean attacks we have seen on the south, the shelling of Yongbyon Island in November 2010 or the sinking of the corvette Cheonan in March 2010, have largely come out of the blue. But this time we've seen military build-up be overt. And with diplomatic channels between the north and the south being cut off, the potential for miscalculation is increasing, creating consequences that could affect businesses, supply chains, infrastructure and national security across Asia Pacific. Our intention this afternoon is to keep our introductory briefing quite short to allow us to cover the myriad of questions we've already received. And as I said, please submit others during the session. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to hand over to Neil.
Thank you, Richard. As Richard stated, there have been a succession of provocative actions and a steady drumbeat of hostile rhetoric from North Korea since the February nuclear test. Rhetoric is nothing new from North Korea. What makes the situation more volatile is the role being played by the North's new leader, Kim Jong-un. This is the first serious crisis of his tenure, and the US and South Korea are uncertain how he will react, what voices within Pyongyang are influencing him, how far he is being controlled by or controlling the military. It is likely that Kim Jong-un is being influenced by figures from the second generation of North Korean leaders. For example, his uncle, Jan Song-thaek, who was moved into a senior position by Kim Jong-il ahead of his death, and his aunt, Kim Kong-hee, Kim Jong-il's sister. They are both thought to be influential figures. One of our expert contributors describes Jang as the power behind the throne in North Korea. While the transition to Kim Jong-un is considered to be complete, personnel changes have continued. This suggests a degree of ongoing political maneuvering within Pyongyang. In July 2012, Ri Yong-ho, the Chief of the General Staff, was removed. The Minister of Defense was removed in December 2012, and earlier this month, Pak Pong-ju was appointed as Prime Minister, replacing Cho Yong-rim. Could I have the next slide, please? Given the number of changes that have involved military figures, it's arguable that these changes may be aimed at shifting the balance of power within the country from the military to the Korean Workers' Party. This idea that Kim Jong-un and his supporters are effectively clipping the military's wings has been supported by uncorroborated reports from sources with dealings in North Korea. It is notable that all four of the senior military figures that accompanied Kim Jong-il's hearse have now been removed or demoted. Attempts to shift the balance of power away from the military may be motivated by a desire to consolidate Kim Jong-un's position. Equally, there are indications that Kim Jong-un and his supporters are seeking to revitalize the economic reform program that was largely abandoned in 2007. The reappointment of Pak as premier, the figure most associated with these reforms, is a particularly significant indicator here. The return to economic reforms makes sense for North Korea, given its struggling economy and reports of serious famine in parts of the country. This is not to say that external factors do not play a role. Past periods of heightened tensions have been instigated by North Korea in an attempt to bring the US to the negotiating table, preferably bilaterally, and this is probably a factor again. Also, there may be a desire to test the new South Korean leadership. Nevertheless, these internal dynamics may explain some key aspects of North Korea's recent behavior. The tough actions Pyongyang have taken are clearly intended to bolster Kim's standing with the North Korean population and to distract attention from domestic issues. But they also may be intended to cement his position as a tough commander-in-chief with the army. Alternatively, some of the more provocative actions that have occurred may have been instigated by members of the military, perhaps including some of those individuals that Kim Jong-un and his supporters have sidelined, in order to strengthen the military's hand politically. What does this domestic angle mean for the way in which the situation on the peninsula is likely to proceed? Could I have the next slide, please? The fact that the escalation may be driven by domestic political factors suggests that the North is not seeking escalation for its own sake, and none of the actors within North Korea have a rational interest in seeing open conflict with South Korea and the US, since war would almost certainly mark the end of the current government in North Korea. Equally, if the North Koreans were planning to deliberately escalate the situation to open conflict, their strategic interests would arguably be better served by a surprise attack rather than the steady mounting of tensions that we have seen. Kim Jong-un's need to appear tough means that the North is to an extent trapped by its own rhetoric. He can't back down now without a face-saving move of some kind. The most likely scenario is a missile test in the Sea of Japan, given the observed movement of missiles and mobile launchers to the east coast. South Koreans are now describing the possibility of this as very high. A fourth nuclear test is also possible. While not a prerequisite for a further test, the announcement that North Korea would restart the Yongbyon reactor earlier this month marked a strong signal to the South and the US of the North's nuclear intentions. All that said, given how dramatic an escalation this would represent, it is less likely than a missile test. Either a launch or a nuclear test could be painted domestically as a victory and allow the North to roll back its rhetoric. More seriously, the North could launch a limited military action, for example the shelling of Banyang Island, as it threatened in March this year, or an asymmetric attack of the kind seen with the sinking of the Cheonan in 2010. This is arguably less likely than a missile test, as in the past the North has relied on the element of surprise to make such attacks effective, and at present, South Korean military is on high alert. Probably the key date to watch here is 15th of April, the birthday of Kim Il-sung. The North, in its statement warning foreign embassy staff, set a deadline of 10th of April, however, and the visit of US Secretary of State Kerry to the region from 12th of April would also be a potentially fitting backdrop from the North Korean perspective. Can I have the next slide, please? Given the heightened military preparedness south of the border, an attack would almost certainly provoke a significant response. The South Koreans and the US have been talking openly about counter-provocation plans, allowing for a comparable retaliatory strike on the North Korean unit or units that launched the original attack. The possibility that Kim Jong-un, his supporters, or senior members of the military can misjudge the extent of the South Korean response to a provocative action is therefore the most likely scenario for escalation. The closure of military hotlines linking North and South increases the risk of such a miscalculation, or that the response to such an attack could escalate before the two sides can react. Compounding the risk of escalation, it's worth noting that for Kim Jong-un, it will be very difficult politically, both in terms of the domestic audience and in terms of the factional politics outlined earlier, not to respond to a South Korean reprisal of this kind. The key risk on the peninsula, therefore, is not of a deliberate escalation to a general conflict by the North, but instead of a miscalculation leading to an accidental escalation. However, to reiterate, we consider the likelihood of a broader conflict to be low. I'd now like to hand over to James Hardy.
Thanks very much. As Neil just made quite clear, we do not think that North Korea is interested in starting a conventional type war with South Korea and the United States. Nonetheless, it's a good opportunity for us to have a quick summary of its conventional capabilities, which you can see here on the screen in front. They've got a active personnel of about 1.2 million, 70% of which are pretty close to the DMZ. They also have reserves of 7.5 million or thereabouts. The key KPA, as we look at it, is well trained, highly disciplined, and of course North Korea is one of the most militarized nations in the world. The Songun military first policy has made that happen. One key element which I think supports the possibility of maybe an asymmetrical attack or some kind of escalation that Neil referred to are real serious investments in special operations forces, which now number about 200,000 strong, and also things like small submarines and semi-submersible infiltration craft, which the North Koreans have used previously to attack South Korea indirectly through guerrilla attacks. Another key thing that we have looked at before, and we maybe are expecting, is something like electronic warfare, whether that be jamming of GPS signals, for example, or more cyber attacks, which we've included here as electronic intelligence warfare. Next slide, please. Now, of course, WMD capabilities, weapons of mass destruction, are the key thing that North Korea is using as an escalatory tactic internationally. Now, here I've got a quick overview of what we think they have. I think Nick Hansen will talk more to this later on, and will certainly give us a much greater detail. What I would say is that the South Korean reports recently of 2 Musudan missiles being taken to the east side of North Korea for tests. I think that is of great interest, and one reason is because it's possibly the first time we would see the Musudan tested, and it would certainly be the first time we've seen it tested or launched from a transporter erector launcher. You can see one here. That's actually the KN-8, but it's on a launcher. That would be a major change in the situation, and would certainly would be of great concern to the US, because previous North Korean missile launches have taken place on predefined sites that we've been able to look at. For example, you've had it on the east side, and the Musudan site on the east side, and you've had it on the Sohae site on the west side. If they're able to launch these things from these missiles from transporter erector launchers, that completely changes the game. Next slide, please. Now let's quickly have a look at South Korean capabilities, which I think Jim Dawson will also go into a bit more detail in the Q&A. South Korea, as you can see, has a much smaller active personnel, 650,000, and its reserves also are much smaller. Of course, it has a massive technological advantage over the North Koreans, and on top of that, it has the US on its US Forces Korea helping out too. I mean, US Forces Korea only has 28,000 troops in country, but in the event of a proper conventional kind of confrontation, then there will be a pretty quick mobilization, probably starting from Okinawa with the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force, and of course that would follow through. I'm sure that the US Forces Korea and the US Pacific Command have extremely detailed plans on how to get people into Korea as quickly as possible. One of the key areas in which they outstrip North Korea is C4ISR. That's something that the North Koreans would be looking to take on, and would be looking to damage very quickly in any kind of conventional attack, because at the moment that is the area in which South Korea and the US have a massive operational advantage. Okay, next slide, please. And here we have, if we're looking back at the WMD, what do the US, Japan, and South Korea have to defend against WMD? Now, probably the best capabilities are actually with the Japanese, because they take it the most seriously, partly because of their constitutional situation. The Maritime Self-Defense Force has SM-3 anti-missile interceptors fitted to its Kongo-class destroyers. You can see one of them here. And there are currently 2 of those in the Sea of Japan, keeping an eye on that. On top of that, the Japanese have a very, very widespread air defense radar network, which includes FPS-3 and FPS-5 radars, and it also has access to the US ANTPY-2 long-range X-band radar, which is actually Shiriki, not Shiriki, my bad there, which is in Aomori Prefecture. And of course, one of the announcements that Chuck Hagel made recently was that they were going to bring in another one and put it down, I think, in Kagoshima in Kyushu. The US brings to the party, well, the US brings everything to the party in a sense. It's got the RC-135 Cobra Ball aircraft. Apparently there are 2 deployed to Okinawa at the moment. Those are airborne early warning for ballistic targets. They've also got the sea-based X-band radar, which has been steaming up towards the area. That's the massive radar, which looks like it's on a mobile oil rig. And as Hagel announced earlier, they've also got THAAD batteries that will be deployed to Guam later in the year as well. And one other thing maybe to take into account, which is Taiwan's new ballistic missile early warning surveillance radar, which is obviously primarily targeting Chinese ballistic missiles pointing at the island. It tracked the December 2012 launch, and certainly is online and ready to go. And I would be it would be surprising, given the US involvement in that program, if the US did not have a link into that system and could use it also for tracking North Korean ballistic missile launches. I will now hand over to Alison, who is going to give a quick overview of our satellite imagery of the area.
So, thanks, James. Yeah, so a significant component of our continuing analysis over North Korea has been commercial satellite imagery. And obviously, this data gives us the ability to gauge the level and pace of the activity and construction over North Korea, which is a completely denied access territory. So over the past 5 years, IHS has found consistently expanding construction at the strategic sites, such as the launch complexes on the western and eastern coasts. As we see here, this is this is the Tonghae Satellite Launching Ground, and then on the western coast, it's the Sohae Satellite Launching Ground, as well as their nuclear facilities. So the top left is the Yongbyon nuclear reactor, which is under construction, and now that we also have satellite imagery analysis over the once defunct, now reactivated 5 megawatt reactor just adjacent to this facility, as well as the level of activity at the Punggye-ri nuclear test site. I will be able to speak directly to these sites in the Q&A, and my co-presenter, Nick Hansen, who has provided analysis to IHS Janes for nearly 5 years now, along with his colleagues at Stanford University, will be able to speak a little bit more specifically to these projects as well. Let's go to the next slide. And now I will hand it over to my colleagues to continue with the remainder of this presentation.
Okay, taking from the maritime perspective, the IHS Maritime Database shows that North Korea's merchant fleet is just over 200 ships. It's a relatively small fleet in terms of size, with an average size of 4,000 deadweight tons, and it's an old fleet with the average age of around 28 years. There are 17 ships within the ocean-going category, which is around above 10,000 deadweight, of which of these, as 95% are over 20 years old, which actually reduces their usability in the international trade. So in essence, the fleet is insignificant on a global scale. Now, as you can see from the image on the right-hand side there, taken from AIS Live, the relatively small and elderly fleet trading pattern of these ships is focused on the west coast, operating between the domestic ports and across the Yellow Sea to China, which is North Korea's largest trading partner. Also, you can see from the AIS map where the regional trade flows are situated, namely Shandong Peninsula in China and western southern South Korea. Move to the next slide, please. Other trade in the region include large volumes of vessels in and out of North Chinese coast on the west side of the Korean peninsula, whilst on the east side, the trade routes to the southern extremities of the Russian Far East and the major ports of Vladivostok and Nadhodka, as well as routes from Japan in the westerly direction. Although the traffic from China would be affected in conflict, ultimately all these shipping routes can be rerouted south. In the unlikely event of the North launching an attack on the south, the port of Incheon within the Seoul National Capital Area could be affected by collateral damage. As can be seen from the graph on the top right, Incheon is an important energy import facility with the highest percentage of ship coolings made up from tankers as well as bulk carriers. The port is a significant regional transit hub with high levels of traffic heading to other South Korean ports or across the Yellow Sea to China. As the graph on the below right, produced from IHS Maritime's movement data, clearly shows, Daesan to the south and Ulsan on South Korean's east coast are major export destinations. LNG accounts for 20% of the total cargo handled in the port during the first 3 months of this year, and any disruption could have a substantial knock-on effect to parts of the country. The facilities are capable of handling the largest LNGs afloat, to around 260,000 cubic meters in size.
The port handles over 22% of the total LNG imported into the south. Over the past 12 months, this terminal has seen 180 separate shipments, totaling 16 million deadweight tons. Any disruption to the port would have significant impact on the marine energy sector for the region. I'll now pass you over to my colleague Gary Lee, who will talk further about the risks to Incheon and the wider region.
Thank you very much, Kristen. So as Kristen has already mentioned, in the unlikely event of military hostilities breaking out between the north and south, there is a high likelihood of collateral damage being inflicted on the port of Incheon, if so it's shelled by the North Korean artillery and missile forces from their demilitarized zone. Incheon is the second largest port in South Korea and situated only a few kilometers from the capital. As Kristen has demonstrated with data from IHS Maritime, the port supplies large quantities of goods and energy in the form of LNG to the capital itself. Although Incheon is around 50 kilometers from the DMZ, which places out of range of the North Korean tubed artillery and long-range rockets, missiles such as Scuds could still be used in bombardments directed against Seoul. And due to the relative inaccuracies of these missiles, the circular error probable of a Scud B is around 1 kilometer, one cannot rule out a potential hit to the port area. Although unlikely, a direct hit of such type on LNG storage facilities by, for example, a 250-kilogram warhead of a Scud missile, the amount of damage that would result would be quite substantial. There are also other largely asymmetrical threats to shipping stemming from the north. These include the use or claims of use of the DPRK's submarine force, including, as James Hardy has mentioned earlier, midget submarines, which have previously demonstrated their ability to infiltrate South Korean defenses along the coast. The North Koreans might also threaten or claim to have already done so, mining the narrow approaches to Incheon, as shown by the narrow pink bands in the AIS screenshot to the right of the slide. As you can see, the approaches to the harbor itself is quite congested, and large numbers of shipping are frequently found there. And any such threat or even claims of threat would likely result in immediate halting of all shipping in the corridor. Now, the result of all of these would have substantial impact on shipping going into South Korea. As Kristen said, large quantities of LNG and container shipping would have to be diverted to ports further south, such as Busan, the largest port in South Korea and the world's 5th largest container port. And potentially this would disrupt supply chains and services sector in Seoul and the northern part of the Republic of Korea. Any potential damage, however unlikely, would see the port itself being taken out of action for at least a few months, and the threat of mines or submarines would require at least a few weeks for the South Korean and US forces to sweep the area and for them to declare it secure. However, it must be stressed once again that this is very much a low probability, high impact scenario based on the very unlikely event of an open military confrontation, where the intent and fear is much higher than the actual capabilities of the North. And now I'll hand back to Richard Jackson.
Thanks, Gary, and thanks, everybody. We're going to move into questions now. We've started to get some in on the panel on the right, so please keep them coming in. But we've also had quite a few in advance of the seminar. So I'm going to start. We've touched on the fact that the likelihood of this escalation into actual military conflict is low, and that remains our view. But we've had a few questions about, with that in mind, what happens if that low likelihood comes to pass? What does a military action look like? How does it develop? What gets involved? And for that, I'm going to hand over to Jim Dorschner on the line. And Jim, if you'd be kind enough to kick off with the answer to that.
Yeah, certainly, Richard. This is Jim Dorschner. I just want to say that the nature of any South Korean response depends on exactly what North Korea does in terms of provocation. The South Koreans, if there is a provocation on the scale of the 2010 attacks, then South Korea will feel compelled to take some sort of military action, probably in the form of airstrikes, possibly even some maritime action. But this will be of a limited nature, graduated in scale, that's intended to demonstrate South Korean resolve and also their relatively advanced capabilities compared to the North Koreans. However, whatever happens after that then depends on how the North Koreans react.
Hi. This is James Hardy here. I'd like to follow up on that. I think everything Jim says is right there. I'd like to follow up because we had a very good story in today's James Defence Weekly from our Seoul correspondent talking about the potential counter-attack plan that the US and South Korea agreed on in late March. And according to senior South Korean officials that we spoke to, the plan would allow South Korea to respond only locally. It would only be allowed to respond to the area in which the provocation took place. So, for example, Yongbyon Island, they would, if that was hit, then they could hit back from that area. And they would also be allowed a second counter-attack, which would be to maybe protect their own forces in the area. But it is the key point, I think, that the South Koreans and the US particularly are interested in making is that this is going to be a very surgical and very, very controlled reaction by the South Koreans, because the last thing anyone wants in South Korea, and especially I think the US, is a reaction to a provocation then being escalatory in itself. So back over to you, Richard.
Great, thanks guys.
James, this is Jim again. I would absolutely concur with that. And the other thing to bear in mind is that as far as the South Korean military is concerned, they're still about 5 or 10 years away from achieving their what they think of as their optimum capabilities in terms of precision strike and intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, command and control capabilities. And so they would like to defer any showdown for as long as possible, even beyond the political and economic ramifications of any kind of conflict.
Great, Jim. Thanks very much. On a slightly connected issue, we've had a lot of questions. I mean, the nuclear issue is obviously at the back of a lot of this. And we've had a lot of questions about the North Koreans' nuclear capability, their ability to deliver a nuclear warhead by missile, their ability to carry out long-range ballistic attacks using nuclear weapons. And I'd kind of like to turn to Nick, if I can, on the line, Nick Hansen, to cover the initial response to that.
Okay. On the nuclear side, the estimates that I've seen, and I worked with Sig Hecker quite a bit, he and his colleagues in the nuclear world thinks they had enough plutonium for somewhere on the order of 6 to 8 rounds, nuclear weapons or devices. And they've already tested 2 of them, we know, in 2006 and 2009. So they may have enough for a few more. And that's basically the reason that I believe they're going to restart the 5-megawatt plutonium production reactor in Yongbyon. That's going on right now. They're actually reconnecting the pipes that they use for cooling, and that's a critical feature. So the other part of it is less known, which is the highly enriched uranium part. How many weapons they would have made, not too many if they only have the complex that was shown to Sig and his other folks that went with him back in 2010. There's probably another facility somewhere producing this, and it has been for quite some time. So the question on how many weapons they have is, I think, unknown, but not too many. As far as being able to miniaturize the warhead and put it onto a missile, that's another story. The 2 first tests, they were very primitive devices. The third test, they said, was a miniaturized device. The consensus that I've seen from the nuclear community is that with a single test like that, that's probably not good enough. And the fact that they've only tested that one shot, and we don't even know whether it was plutonium or uranium, I think there's a big unknown there. As far as the weapons go, there's no question they can take the Nodong, which they tested first successfully in 1993, and that's what the Pakistanis have put nuclear weapons on, if they can miniaturize them. So there's a weapon that can certainly hit Japan and South Korea. The next one up the chain is the Musadin, which they've talked about being moved over to the East Coast, and that's never been tested, nor has a warhead for that ever been tested. So that's kind of an unknown. Whether they're going to shoot that off or not is another question. And the speculation is, of course, that yes, they're going to, and it's going to fly over Japan, and that's not a very good situation. So I can't answer it. It's a political decision. And then you move up the chain, and you get the KN-08, and that was just paraded this past April, a year ago. So that is completely unknown as far as no testing. There may have been some engine tests last summer, but I would doubt that is anywhere near being ready to go, and that's the longest range system. So that's a long-winded answer, so maybe that will help.
Nick, that's great. Thank you very much. Sticking with the military theme just for a moment, James, you touched very briefly on your introduction about the capabilities that the South and the US have in the region that can be used in the event of a North Korean attack. Do you want to just touch a little bit more? We've had a few questions about what measures they have, what capabilities there are arrayed against the North at the moment.
Sure. I mean, the reports, I think the key thing is that if you talk about ballistic missile defense, the key country in the area is Japan. The ballistic missile threat is not necessarily pointed at South Korea. The North Koreans have more than enough conventional missiles, conventional artillery pointed at South Korea. So if they wanted to kick off with South Korea, they have more than enough other opportunities and options to do that. So when we look at BMD, we're obviously looking more at looking at what the US and the Japanese are doing. And the key system, I think, is the SM-3, which is the Standard Missile 3, which is fitted to Aegis destroyers in both the US Pacific Fleet and the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. Now that's a very interesting system, not least because it was probably the first time that the Japanese worked together on a system which has, I mean, it is a defensive capability, but it was one of the few times that the Japanese worked on a joint collaborative program to develop a modern missile or any kind of military program, and this was before they got rid of their kind of ban on military cooperation with anyone. The other thing, of course, as I mentioned, is just a massive array of radars, if you excuse the pun, across Japan. Pretty much every mountain in Japan's got a radar pointing at North Korea. This is a legacy of the 90s when North Korea first started doing ballistic missile tests and threatening Japan in that way. And they've got a combination of these FPS-3 and FPS-5 radars. That doesn't refer to the old US designations. These are actually Japanese designations, just to be clear on that. And those, are designed and ready to pick up anything that the North Koreans fire at them. And in the last 36 hours, we've seen the Japanese really roll out their PAC-3, their Patriot Advanced Capability 3 batteries, which are pretty, across Japan. They've got already 16 different batteries set up across the Kanto region protecting Tokyo. I think they're more worried about possible debris than they are about an attack. I think that's clear. This does not mean that Japan expects North Korea to launch a ballistic missile at it. What it means is that they have to do it for public relations purposes, and B, if there is a missile test, then debris will be something they're worried about.
Great, James. Thanks ever so much. Kind of unsurprisingly, we've had a large number of questions about the other big player in the region, namely China. I'm going to throw this open to the team, and basically it's questions about the Chinese, what Chinese military are doing and what Chinese support is given to North Korea, but also what China might be doing to try and contain the crisis, what their relationship is in the whole process. I'm going to throw that open to Gary, maybe, or James.
Gary. Thank you, James. The Chinese attitude towards North Korea, as everyone, I think, realizes, is slightly different from what is usually portrayed in the press. China has been very frustrated with North Koreans' belligerent stance, especially in recent years. It increasingly views Pyongyang as quite a irritant and trying to drag China into diplomatic crisis after diplomatic crisis. The new leadership under Xi Jinping in Beijing is going to be no different. And I think it's worth noting that unlike previous Chinese leadership, such as Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping had spent time in the PLA in his earlier years. So he does know how to face up to the military game, as it were. Some questions have come in regarding whether the Chinese military is willing to intervene or assist North Korea in a military scenario. I think it's important to make it very, very clear that the Chinese do not have any troops or any military bases based in the north. And in recent days, we have seen hints, as it were, from Chinese or semi-official Chinese state media suggesting that the Chinese military might not intervene to help the North Koreans if North Korea is the one to start any potential conflict. This is to make the positions very clear on just where China stands on the Sino-North Korean alliance treaty that they've previously signed. In regards to the posture of the Chinese military in this crisis, we have not really detected any sizable movement along the border, despite certain claims in media outlets. The three main group armies facing North Korea, the 16th, 39th, and 40th group armies of the Shenyang military region, are placed relatively close to the frontier in any case, and do not need to be moved unless a military scenario does present itself. And in such an unlikely scenario, the most likely movements from these formations would be one to contain the hostilities, to look after any refugees that might come across the border. In fact, we know that many of these military formations have practiced this in the past, and you know, by most accounts, the Chinese would like to prevent any North Koreans from coming into the northeastern provinces, where there's also a large population of ethnic Koreans in the population there.
Yeah, I've got nothing to add, so excellent answer.
We've had a couple of questions about risks in Seoul and cancelling business trips and things like that. Obviously, that's a question for individuals to answer themselves, but I mean, I just reiterate our initial assessment that the likelihood of this escalating is low. The things we've been talking about now are the extreme scenarios that come from a miscalculation or an accidental border firing that result in escalation, but it's our assessment that this isn't what any side is looking to do. James?
Yeah, I think that I mentioned earlier that the two areas where I think we will see more movement, and I've been surprised to see not see more movement, is in things like GPS jamming. I mean, North Korea is believed to have acquired some pretty hefty GPS jammers from from Russia, and is not afraid to use them. And there's some evidence that they were using them last year to jam civil aviation coming into Seoul. Although, to make that clear, I think there was never any danger to aircraft because they have backup systems that allow them to navigate and land without too much trouble. Although there is a one situation, I think, where a possible aircraft was caused to crash, but it was a test aircraft, not a civilian airliner in any way. The other area we want to look at is cyber attacks. There was a report out of Seoul this morning from Yonhap saying that North Korea has been kind of officially blamed for last month's cyber attacks on South Korean banks and media outlets. I think those are the kind of areas where we'd see, because they're ultimately deniable, and they are irritating rather than fatal, and that is, of course, what the North Koreans would like to achieve.
Cheers, guys. We've got another question about nuclear weapons. We've had a question about our best estimate of when the North Koreans might be able to compress their materials down to miniaturize down to a warhead size. Nick, best estimate?
Best estimate that I've seen came from some of the folks in, like down in Los Alamos and places that are very familiar with that, and the consensus was that they're going to need to test more of these small weapons to make sure that they can miniaturize them. The other thing that you keep in mind is that they probably got the drawings and the information on how to build them from the AQ Khan folks in Pakistan back quite a while ago. So they probably have a very good head start. But if this one that they just tested in February was in fact their first attempt at a miniaturization of a weapon, then they're getting closer. But the consensus is they're going to have to test a few more times, and that's about the best I can do. Project that on out, maybe a year, 2, 3, and they're going to have to produce more plutonium, and that takes a while. once they get the reactor started, it's about 6 months to a year before the rods are ready, and then they have to reprocess them. So it's not a quick process to get more plutonium. Again, the unknown question is how much highly enriched uranium do they have?
Cheers, Nick. Coming back to the worst case scenario again, we've had the questions about what are we likely to see, how are we likely to know that that is becoming more likely, how are we likely to see that North Korea isn't looking just to make statements and raise attention, but actually wants to do something, actually a physical, tangible act. And I think the things we want to look at that point are a large-scale mobilization of reserves, a large-scale movement of troops across the country heading towards the DMZ. James said that 70% of their active troops are at the DMZ. What we see is more troops heading back towards that direction. We just have not seen that at the moment. Troops at the moment are being used to ready the capital for birthday celebrations. They're used as construction workers at the moment, not deployed as the military. And I think probably the most important indicator of all that we'd see is they'd stop making public statements or threats. They want the actual tensions in the region to be lowered. They don't want the other side to be ready for this. The previous attacks, actual physical attacks, have come when the rhetoric has been absent. It might be worth, Alison, I hope you don't mind just throwing you in, but to think about some of the things we might be able to see from satellite imagery and any of the sort of satellite images that you've got, just to sort of touch a bit on that sort of capability and how that might be able to pitch in.
Sure, very briefly. Though we've sort of taken a look recently at sort of the Kaesong facilities, the city of Kaesong, some of the areas throughout the DMZ, we're not seeing troop movements per se the way people might think it could be visible on satellite imagery. Certainly, we've seen and we've published many images of like a 60-person or company level North Korean troop formation, and it's certainly an indication of activity and readiness. I have not seen the numbers and actually even the vehicles that I think are indicative of a mass presence of troops in the areas that people would expect to see them. The activity that we've most sort of seen is just a continued pace of construction at some of their strategic sites. And when it comes to mobile launchers, we've found new mobile facilities, certainly on their western coast, sort of north of the island of Yongbyon. There are definitely some surface-to-air missile sites that are occupied, some air defense artillery sites that are occupied, a little bit of concealment here and there, meaning concealment of some weapons. I have to say, in the large amounts that people might expect, we just simply haven't seen the level that one would associate with such an increased rhetorical climate at this point. Nick Hansen's certainly done his share of analysis. Perhaps you might have something to add.
Yes, we have not seen very much of the activity. Another important part of what the military has to do at this time of year is they get into the planting of crop cycle. And I think what we is the military starting to do and plant their own fields because they got to grow their own food. So that if that doesn't happen, that's a very important clue, and I think it's happening.
Yeah, I mean, we even see this is kind of it's kind of hard for somebody who's studied a lot of countries because it doesn't sort of follow the lines of military logic that an imagery analyst might be used to when they're looking at countries. But you do see a lot of crop cultivation, drying of grain. I mean, we see grain drying next to the nuclear reactor under construction. So it's not quite, they don't follow sort of the similar kinds of militaristic aesthetic as we see in some other countries. But, so having said all that, yes, I mean, we're really just not seeing sort of the kind of garrison or deployed levels that I think one would easily associate with what we're seeing these days.
This is Jay Orchner. I had another thought for you, sort of a counter indicator, and that in the last few weeks we've seen some of the highest sortie rates recently recorded for the North Korean Air Force. And typically, if they're preparing for full-scale or large-scale military operations, sortie rates tend to decline so that they can perform maintenance and husband and protect resources in advance of the military activity. So in an oddball way, it's a sort of an indicator that they're not actually getting ready for more hostilities.
Great, guys. Thanks ever so much. Jim, I'm going to come back to you, actually, because we had a question earlier about increased intelligence activity by the North in the South. I wonder whether you could just elaborate a little bit on whether we're seeing any of that, whether we're likely to see any of that, and what more we could say about that.
Sure. Actually, most people realize that the North Koreans have had a very robust and extensive agent infiltration, intelligence collection operation in the South going back to the 1950s. And however, we haven't seen any indications that this has increased or that it's getting any better. And as a matter of fact, the South Koreans' counterintelligence capabilities are quite good, and they have a lot of experience working on this. So I would say that no. The answer is we don't see much of that at all.
Thanks ever so much, Jim. I mean, one of the things that it's vaguely connected to that, I think, is the fact that actually you don't need a covert intelligence service to find out what the plans of the South and the Americans are. The Americans are being very open about this. I know that Samuel Locklear, the commander of U.S. Pacific Command.
Well, and I'm sure they read James.
Well, maybe they should, but I know the Americans themselves. Admiral Locklear spoke at the Senate Armed Forces Committee this week. The Deputy Secretary of Defense spoke at a CSI ICE briefing, and if you listen to what they said there, they were very clear about what the reaction would be. So in terms of actually understanding what's going on in the South.
Exactly, and I think that's intentional in this case.
Great. We've had a couple of questions. I know Gary and Kristen talked about ports earlier on, but I've had a couple of questions about airports and air travel as well, and I just wondered whether the guys could just touch on the airports in South Korea as well and the risks there.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Richard. Yes, well, of course, there are two airports that's of immediate concern that's relatively close to the DMZ. One is Gimpo International Airport, and the other one is Incheon International Airport. Now, out of the two, I would argue that the Gimpo International Airport is possibly at slightly higher risk than Incheon International. This is purely because of the proximity towards Seoul itself, and also the fact that the highest concentration of attacks directed against Seoul is likely to fall there rather than at the port itself. What I should have mentioned earlier, of course, is that despite the fact that the North Koreans do have large numbers of artillery and rocket pieces pointed towards Seoul from the DMZ, it's unlikely, to be a complete concentration of all of their artillery pieces. Some of them is likely to be directed against other targets, more strategically important ones than Seoul. Nevertheless, we cannot rule out the possibilities of stray rounds or even a group of rounds landing near Gimpo International, and the damage to infrastructure as well as parked aircraft would be quite considerable should any of these ordinances arise.
Thanks, Gary. Getting back to implications in North Korea, we've had a couple of questions about what happens at the end of this in North Korea. If the North Koreans don't manage to extract concessions from the US, from the South or from others, what actually does this do to Kim Jong-un's credibility? What does it do to his relationships with the military? What are the risks of civil unrest and maybe even his overthrow? And Neil, I think that's one for you.
Okay, thank you, Richard. There's 2 points to make here, probably. The first would be that from the North Korean domestic perspective, extracting concessions is really a secondary consideration. All they need to do is be able to present this as a win domestically. Now, there is a counterpoint there, which is, say we saw a South Korean reprisal of some sort, I think the North Koreans would be very loath to leave it at that. There would have to be some sort of North Korean response to the response for the domestic audience. But the second point is that in terms of domestic politics, Kim Jong-un as a figure is not optional for the North Koreans. He is the heir, he is the grandson of Kim Il-sung, who is still revered, still considered to be effectively the head of state, even though he's passed away. One day he will go into the mausoleum with his father and his grandfather. So he as a figure is not something that the North Korean, even if there were internal instability, even if people within the military wanted to remove him, they wouldn't be able to, because there is no alternate figure who could replace him within the North Korean ideological system.
Great. Neil. One for James and Jim, I think. We've had a question about a cruise missile that the South Koreans presented just after the last nuclear test in the north. What do we know about that platform, and what's its potential deployment?
Well, the short answer to the first question is we don't know very much. And the reason for that is that South Korea has been very, very quiet on its cruise missile programs and its extended range missile programs for a number of reasons. One is because the Americans weren't very happy about it. They didn't want South Korea to develop a long-range missile capability because, of course, in doing that, it removes American control over basically over contingencies on the Korean Peninsula. Now, last year, Lee Myung-bak, who was called president at the time, managed to get some concessions from the U.S. side, and one of those was the expansion of more of a relaxation of rules surrounding South Korea's development and purchase of UAVs and long-range cruise missiles. So this is interesting because what I think this looks towards, and this is something Jim mentioned earlier, is that this looks towards the South Koreans taking operational command in 2015, and of course in 2020 or in 10 years' time, being able to control their own battle space in a way at the moment they really can't. And that really ties into things like also their acquisition of Global Hawk UAVs, which they're looking at the moment. They rejected it last year because they thought it was too expensive. Now they've come back and said, actually, we probably do need that. And it's all about building up a combination of ISR facilities and ISR assets, for example, Global Hawk and other UAVs, but also building off standoff air-launched missiles and obviously standoff missiles, which can be ship-launched as well. Jim, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's hard not to overstress how important long-range standoff precision strike is for the South Korean armed forces. This crisis highlights that because in this case, say they had to react. Right now, they can only do so with say F-15Ks, fighter jets. But if they have a long-range unmanned strike capability that they can launch particularly from ships like destroyers or submarines, as well as from aircraft, it gives them the ability to deliver pretty punishing blows to North Korea at minimal risk to themselves, and that's very important.
Brilliant. Yeah, if I can quickly just jump in to absolutely back up what you said, a really interesting couple of announcements in the last few days. Today, Raytheon have announced that South Korea has opted for its AESA radar for its F-16 upgrade. Now, the AESA radar, this is a bit kitty, but if you'll stick with me for it, the AESA radar is really kind of a massive upgrade on the existing fire control radars that the Koreans' F-16s have, and it means that they will be able to do things like much longer beyond visual range missile launches from their F-16s if they want to. They've already got it for the F-15s, but it's a big thing for them. And another thing is, actually that's me done. I'm going to hand back to you.
Cool. We're coming towards the end of our hour, but I've got another question which comes back to the nuclear issue, but is this time not about delivering it on the end of a ballistic missile, but what about the potential or the capability for the use of nuclear devices or more specifically dirty bombs in the south? Nick, is that something that you could just touch on?
Well, yes, I can. A dirty bomb, of course, leaves a lot of radiation, and that's a bad thing. And you'd have to get it there, and they have plenty of means of getting it there. So that's a possibility. I don't know how you'd even guess that they've tested such a thing to make sure that it does work, but it's certainly a possibility.
Cheers. I mean, I think my assessment would be that given what we're saying about the North not wishing to escalate this, not wishing to drive this forward as an actual conflict, and the fact that anything like that going off in the South is pretty rapidly going to be pinned, the finger's going to be pointed at the North, I would suggest that we're still in the highly, very unlikely possibility.
I think that's true. I think one of the interesting things that came out of today's interview that we had with a senior South Korean official that our sole correspondent sent over to us was that they are actually looking again at terrorism as a possible North Korean tactic, which obviously hasn't been on the radar so much recently. I mean, obviously we look back to the 80s and 70s, then you had the bombing of a Air Korea flight. And of course, you had the multiple assassination attempts on South Korean heads of state, most notably, of course, in Myanmar. So the fact that the South Koreans are raising this as a possible worry is interesting in itself. Whether that's just rhetoric on the South Korean part, it's obviously a bit too early to say.
Yeah, I mean, it would make sense for them to do that. I mean, whether it's as a result of a specific threat, I think it's unlikely. I think it's probably just sensible contingency planning. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. We're coming to the end of our hour here. Just very briefly in summary, we've talked in great detail about what might happen and the missiles and the risks of terrorist attacks as we finished on in the south. But I'd just like to reiterate our initial forecast that we don't see this as a heading towards actual conflict. There's a low risk that it escalates unintentionally, but actually none of the parties here are really looking to drive this as a conflict. And I think that's the real take-home message that I'd like you to go home with. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this event. I hope you found it useful and informative. I know we haven't got to every single question, but that's partly because we've had so many great ones. A copy of the slides with a simultaneous audio recording will be made available to all subscribers of Intelligence Centre's modules and DS forecasts, and we'll let you know where you can get hold of this in the next couple of days. When the session ends, there'll be a questionnaire on your screen. It'd be really great if you could fill it in and provide us with any feedback so we can look to actually make these seminars even stronger going forward. As I said right at the start, we run 50 of these a year, and we look forward to seeing you at other on-land briefings. The next one is tomorrow, Thursday at 1500 UK time, 10 o'clock Eastern Standard, looking at Navy League Sea Air Space 2013, key themes and takeaways. It'll feature our naval experts discussing their pick of the key highlights, themes and takeaway messages from the show and conference. Finally, thank you all again for your questions and your time this afternoon, and goodbye.